So I'm really curious about your own background. You arrived in the States in the 70s as a youngster with your family, but you were, I think you mentioned before, you're not just an immigrant, but you're also a refugee, kind of a double others there. So kind of tell us about your experience growing up. I understand you grew up in Pennsylvania, and kind of how was that, arriving as a youngster, very young, with your family and being a refugee as well as an immigrant?
Well, I was 4 years old when I came as a refugee to the United States, but my parents were in their 40s. I mean, they're younger than I am now. And if you can imagine what that would be like, they basically had to pick up their lives and flee to another country, leaving behind much of their property and almost all of their relatives, and start over in a foreign land and in a state they'd probably never heard of before. For me, as a 4-year-old, it was an experience that was, for the most part, not too bad, because when you're a little boy, a child, you can adjust pretty easily as long as your loved ones are with you. I think the hardest part for me, though, was what happened initially when we got to the United States. So we were there with 130,000 other Vietnamese refugees, and we were put into one of 4 refugee camps. Ours happened to be in Pennsylvania. And in order to leave one of these refugee camps, Vietnamese people had to have an American sponsor. Could be a church, could be a family, for example. And typically the sponsor would take an entire family, but that didn't happen in our case. So one sponsor took my parents, one sponsor took my 10-year-old brother, one sponsor took 4-year-old me. And when you're 4 years old, you don't really understand the complexities of what's happening. I was being taken away to give my parents time to get on their own feet and then be able to take care of their children. But when you're 4 years old, you only understand the sense of abandonment that's taking place. So it was a very painful experience for me initially, and I was taken away for a few months. My brother, who was 10, didn't come home for 2 years. So he likes to tell me that's how we know mom and dad love you more, because they couldn't stand to be kept away from me for too long. But he turned out okay. He went to Harvard. Okay, everything's fine. He's a doctor. So I think the experience was all right. But for my parents, I think it must have been very difficult to start over. They were already established people. And then they had to become, their first jobs in Pennsylvania were as custodians. And then they became blue collar. My dad became a blue collar worker. My mom couldn't find a job. And they, had to rebuild themselves in the United States and live the typical immigrant story, except that they were also refugees who had been forced to come to this country. Immigrants choose, typically, to go to a certain place. There's a different psychological mindset, I think. So in many ways, it was really, really difficult experience. And as I got older, I became more aware of how difficult the experience was, especially by the time I was 10 or 11, watching them work in a grocery store that they started in San Jose, California, for 12 to 14 hours a day. I could see how physically exhausting that was, and to bear the burden of having to try to carve out a new life for themselves and their children, and support relatives in Vietnam who were desperate for help during the 1980s. So that experience has left an imprint on me in terms of memory and emotions that I've never forgotten.
Mm-hmm. And then you mentioned your older brother at Harvard, and you didn't do too bad yourself going to Berkeley, and your family kind of fulfills that model minority myth that we, as Asian Americans, we hear all about. And it's a curse and a blessing. And how do you feel, your family? I mean, you, as you said, your parents, and my parents had the Chinese restaurant. We had it in Ohio. So grew up working in the restaurant business and seeing how hard they work. But obviously, and I think they end up sending you to a private Catholic school, right? School, education. So you guys obviously done really well. And how do you kind of, talk a bit about the minority myth, the model minority myth? It's served us well, but it's also has been a curse, hasn't it?
Sure. Yeah, I think you could obviously look at people like my parents, who became eventually, very financially successful, my brother and me, and the jobs that we've had. And you could hold us up as some kind of emblem of the good refugee or a good immigrant story, which I think is really pernicious, because a good immigrant or good refugee narrative requires its opposite, the bad immigrant or the bad refugee. And certainly we see that being deployed in many countries today, but especially in the United States, this desire to keep out a certain class or kind of people based on their economic standing, their cultural background, their religious beliefs, and so on. And so the good refugee or the good immigrant is always going to be used in this way. And my brother and I both resist this kind of idea, because I think if you base a refugee or an immigrant policy on people like us, my brother who became a doctor and a professor, and me who became a writer and a professor, you're going to have a refugee or immigrant policy that doesn't admit very many people at all. And I think that's the exact point. And so I'm all for a refugee and immigration policy that is based on a different set of criteria. Of course, it's important to take into account people's economic abilities and education and so on, but refugee and immigration policies also need to be based on humanity and on common sense, and on a belief that I strongly hold, which is a belief in equality, that refugees and immigrants have the right to be mediocre just like every other American. So, and in the case of, Southeast Asians, Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians who came to the United States because of the fallout from the Vietnam War, what we see is that certainly there are some of them who became the so-called model minority, but there are still high degrees of educational, economic issues, and partly that's due to the level of war trauma that people suffered, and also that a lot of these people came from rural backgrounds that were not prepared to quickly assimilate into American life, unlike those with, these people coming here with educational visas, engineers, and so on and so forth. And so that helps to dispel some of this idea of the model minority myth that all Asian Americans are predisposed to excellence in some way. I think what's happened, obviously, is that the United States has socially engineered the model minority myth by admitting a certain class of Asian immigrants or Asian refugees who tend to predominate. But I assume in Asia that there are a lot of mediocre people. Okay, so Asians are not looking around their countries, I think, and thinking, God, we're all like really good at math and we're all going to be doctors. It just can't happen. So as typical, the United States has skimmed the cream of the crop, done the brain drain to get a certain kind of Asian to come to the United States. And then they fit into a certain narrative here in the States where they are the models for other so-called minorities who may not be so successful. And a lot of Asian Americans, I think, do resist that kind of a narrative. Some of them don't, unfortunately, but a lot of Asian Americans are very aware of how they're being deployed to fit into a certain political narrative in the United States and don't want to be seen as the model.
Well, I think what I love about the Asian American documentary is growing up as a Chinese American immigrating to the States when I was 10 and from Taiwan, and knowing, we are I guess we were the Chinese American, wave, and not really knowing that much about the later immigrants, the Vietnamese. And you write eloquently in the June issue of Time about the Mong American police officer who was there. He's the one we all saw and we're all shocked. He looked like us. And his partner is, bending on George Floyd's neck. And Total is the officer's name. And you write eloquently about the other side of the story. And I just finished reading it, and I find it, I think the humanity, it is, we see what we want to see as model minorities. And sometimes we forget the other side or just are not aware of it. And if we're not aware of it as Asian Americans, how can white Americans or Black Americans know about it? So I thought the documentary is really powerful. And you also write very eloquently in Sympathizer, the role of Hollywood. We know our stories, especially the war. And my brother is like you, loves war movies. I saw all the war movie you described. He's seen it, and he actually became a veteran and went to Iraq. So is that mythology, that Hollywood writes about, and you are trying to kind of, in some ways, I feel you're trying to demystify it with your writing. And how do you feel about, in terms of the becoming right now, you're one of congratulations, by the way, being the first Asian American to be on the board of Pulitzer, which I find it fascinating, and I'm surprised. So how do you feel your role is now that, I think the pen is mightier than the sword, kind of you're writing the story of Asian American, or that's something that I'm really curious about.
Well, I think people were shocked to know that I was the first Asian American member of the Pulitzer Board. But right around the time that was announced, the New York Times ran an article showing, who composed the elite of American society, that is the Fortune 500, Congress, so on and so forth. And the overwhelming majority of people in these positions were white, still are white, right? So it's not a surprise that an institution like the Pulitzer, which is very institutional, very elitist, has had issues becoming diversified. And that, I think, speaks to the challenges that we face. Now, for me as a writer, most of my life is spent sitting alone in a room, writing, living in my own mind, and writing and reading are very individual enterprises. But another dimension of me is someone who tries to go out and claim a public presence and speak in a certain way. And here I'm trying to follow through on a longstanding tradition of Asian American culture, which is that we believe that we are not just individuals, but that we're a part of a movement engaged in a very long-term project of trying to advocate for Asian Americans and change American society. So writers have a role in this. That's not just about ourselves, but about this larger movement, this larger cause. And I think it's to me, that's still a really crucial thing. I mean, I've been given this platform because of the Pulitzer Prize, and it's crucial for me to use it to extend what I think of as the Asian American Project. Now, the Asian American Project today, I think, given the huge changes that have taken place after 1965 because of civil rights and immigration, has led to the overwhelming majority of Asian Americans arriving here or being born here after 1965. And they, I think, have perhaps a different understanding of Asian American history than those who were formed through the Asian American movement of the 1960s, or who have some understanding of what Asian Americans have gone through since they've been here, whether it's the 19th century with the arrival of Chinese immigrants or the 18th century with the arrival of Filipino sailors on Spanish galleons. And so my task is not simply to praise the Asian American community and to advocate for it, but to locate us within this very long global history. And that's why what happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd is so crucial, because we would totally misunderstand this if we thought this was only a contemporary event. Like, it's only now that white police officers are killing black men while Asian Americans are watching or guarding or on the sidelines. This incident has so much power because it embodies centuries of global history that brought black people to the United States as slaves, and that brought Asians here to the United States, oftentimes either as menial labor, or in the case of people like Mong refugees, the parents of Du Tao, as people who wouldn't be here if it weren't for American wars overseas. So when we see this graphic, horrifying image, we have to unpack it so that people understand the history that has led us to this point. So that's where I see my role in the public face, as someone who can try to articulate this, try to defend and advocate for Asian Americans, but when they're responsible for injustice, to hold them and us to account as well.
Well, I just saw your tweet from 2 days ago. You said, if Asian Americans are on the side of justice, our job is to criticize our own community. I have no problem calling out Vietnamese Americans for the racism, their complicity, and their hypocrisy. And so you kind of do it both ways, telling the story, but also calling it out. And in terms of, I mean, Asians, it's not just whites who are racist. I think Asians are as well. So you also have been able to do that. And and how do you now, you teach at a very, very prestigious university. And you are, in fact, I know quite a few of my interns. One of my interns used to be your students, and we're very much inspired by your class. So how do you now teach these young the students in terms of their role in America and in society? I'm sure it's not easy. I mean, we arrived in the 70s. And it hasn't been easier. In some ways, materially, I think Asian Americans, as you pointed out, I think we've been a lot more fortunate than African Americans and definitely Hispanic and others. But how do you now, I mean, and the students are probably out there protesting, and we've seen protests here in Hong Kong as well this last year. How do you kind of teach them? How do you are they curious, or are they really interested in the, it seems to me identity is something that they're maybe more interested than previously. I don't know. I'm really curious.
Well, it just depends on the context, but in general, of course, they're curious, and then it depends what kind of class they're going to take. So in my Asian American literature course, Asian American students and non-Asian Americans come because they're intrigued by this idea of Asian Americans and Asian American writings. Most of them know nothing about it besides having read one book, perhaps. And so it's my job to take that curiosity and educate them, but also to expose them to this long history of Asian American literature, Asian American history, and our connections to all of these historical events that I never knew anything about when I was in high school. Like, I don't think I ever was taught about Japanese American internment, for example, or Chinese immigration and so on. And you mentioned Hollywood earlier. This is what we're up against. Like, the force of American society, but the force of most societies, is not designed to educate their people about what really happened in the history. The force of popular culture and general education and so on is mostly about trying to reinforce a narrative that pleases national audiences. So Americans want stories that affirm them as Americans. And so we're working against so much those of us who want to tell the stories of Asian Americans in this case. So I also teach a course on the Vietnam War. And again, the students have heard about the Vietnam War. All they know about it is kind of a bad war. And that's about it. So, but they're there because they're either curious or because it's a requirement that they have to take. So my job is to both, elevate the curious, but also grab the ones who are there for the requirement. And I think I can do it because the point of teaching a course like that is not simply to say, I'm Vietnamese, I come from the Vietnam War, therefore it's important. The point of the course is to say, look, the Vietnam War, like almost every other incident you can pick in American history, if you unravel it, shows everything about the United States. Why are we a military-industrial complex? Why are we in Asia? Why are there refugees from that country here? Why are these wars fought disproportionately by poor men and especially poor men of color historically? So these are ways to get to the students and to show them that these things are not isolated at all. And then finally, I'm always trying to learn myself to understand my own limitations. I've never thought a lot, for example, about our relationship to indigenous populations and Native Americans. I'm teaching a graduate seminar now, though, on decolonization, because I want to understand, where do Asian Americans fit into this history of the United States if we take into account, or if we start from the fact that this country is born from colonization and genocide and the conquering or the near conquering of Native peoples. It's a very uncomfortable story for Asian Americans to hear, because we come to the United States primarily through the immigrant and refugee experience. And we think, well, we affirm the American idea of the immigrant story, making America great. It does, but at whose expense? I mean, it is a total contradiction in regards to the fact that the country was built and is built on colonization. It's a very challenging topic to try to think through, but I think it's absolutely crucial.
Well, we're here in Hong Kong, so we know decolonization these days very well, and it is something that we're still dealing with, and I think we're going to be dealing with it for a while. But one other question I wanted to curious, I think, is when did you realize you were an Asian American? I mean, because Asian American is a very American term, right? Here in Asia, I mean, either you're from Philippines or you're from Korea. People don't. Maybe more these days because of the rise of Asia and so on and so forth, but it is still defined by a national boundary. But Asian American, I know when I became aware that I was an Asian American was very much the Vincent Chin case, because I was living in Ohio as in university and seeing that protest and somebody like Helen Xiao leading the way. So that was when I realized I'm an Asian American. I'm very proud of it. But I'm curious, for you, when did that happen, that you realized you went from being Vietnamese American to an Asian American?
I remember when I was growing up, my parents had a small business that was called the Oriental Funding Corporation. And that was my first sense of us being something besides Vietnamese. But even then I thought, that's kind of weird. What is an Oriental? Then I got to high school, and it was primarily white high school, but there was, a good percentage of us who were of Asian descent, but we didn't know what to call ourselves, and we knew we were different from the white mainstream of this school. But every day at lunch, we gather in a corner of the campus, and we call ourselves the Asian Invasion. So we were starting to get to some kind of consciousness. That wasn't political, but there's sort of a cultural sense of exclusion and the need to belong with each other. Then I got to Berkeley, and that's when I became an Asian American. I was very fortunate to arrive at a campus which was one of the major centers of ethnic studies and Asian American studies thinking, and had some of the pioneers of Asian American studies like Ronald Takaki, Elaine Kim, Saling Wong, all of whom I took courses with, Maxine Kingston. So that's how I became an Asian American. And you're right, it's a very American phenomenon. You have to explain this to basically anybody else outside of the United States. And yet I think it's a very powerful pivot to be on. It has its blind spots, like I said, in regards to Native Americans and other issues too. But it allows for a critique of race and class and immigration that is useful in other contexts. So, for example, I have a new novel coming out called The Committed. It's a sequel to The Sympathizer. It's set in Paris of 1982, and it's about Vietnamese and ethnic Chinese refugees in Paris. Now, there in Paris, they don't have the possibility of a hybrid identity. I mean, it's not a part of French culture to think that you could be a hybrid kind of person. So here I am introducing a hybrid kind of perspective that allows me to criticize some of the blind spots of French culture. And the French have a very hard time dealing with race and colonialism, and perhaps introducing an Asian American perspective from the writer, not from the character, allows me to point out certain kinds of hypocrisies and contradictions in French culture that the French have a hard time reconciling with. And likewise in Asia as well, I think this I've experienced this being an Asian American or a Vietnamese American in a Vietnamese context. I think allows me to see that some of the ways in which minority relations in Vietnam are deeply problematic. Vietnam has 53 ethnic minorities, and they could really benefit from an ethnic studies approach to what's going on there. And I assume that might be true for other Asian countries as well. So we have our limitations, and we have a lot to learn when we go to Asian countries, obviously. But at the same time, bringing an Asian American perspective, especially with its political lineage and its political history of being able to critique power and racism, it can be really useful elsewhere.
Now that you really achieved a fame. I remember watching you after I think Sympathizer. I read Sympathizer, and you were interviewed on Charlie Rose, and I just was riveted in watching the interview. And then subsequently, you really become quite well known in the Asian American community. But I'm curious, how has that translated to your in Vietnam? I mean, are you hearing? Do they know who you are? Are they inviting you for things, or are you something that they don't want to deal with? I mean, I'm just curious. And you have been back, I assume, to Vietnam since you left as a child.
I've been back to Vietnam several times, but not since the publication of The Sympathizer. And I think partly that was because if you read The Sympathizer, it's fairly critical of Vietnamese communism and the legacy of the Vietnamese Revolution. And it's a very sensitive topic in Vietnam. So the novel was published in 2015. We're now 2020, and it still hasn't been published in Vietnam. And I don't really want to get into the details because I don't want to imperil the possibility of getting the book published. But it's challenging to talk about a narrative that is not totally endorsed by the state, or that does not totally endorse the state view of history. And so I think for the Vietnamese in Vietnam, when I won the Pulitzer Prize, it was kind of an interesting experience because they mentioned that a Vietnamese person had won the Pulitzer Prize. They didn't say what it was for. Right? Okay. It's really interesting that the Pulitzer Prize has somehow got so much cachet that non-Americans care about it, but they do. And that was one sign that even Vietnamese people registered that this was something prestigious and that they were proud of a Vietnamese person for having won it, but it was still too difficult to talk about what the actual thing was. And for Vietnamese Americans, it's kind of also complicated because the majority of Vietnamese Americans fled from communism or are descended from people who fled from communism. And I chose to write a novel from the perspective of a communist spy. And for a good number of Vietnamese Americans, that's literally a red flag. That they just will not read this book because they don't want to. They just don't think it's possible to tell this kind of a story without endorsing communism. And of course, that is partly the kind of worldview, both from Vietnam and Vietnamese Americans, that the book wants to criticize. But the history is so complicated that people, even 45 years later, are still entrenched in some of these political divisions. But nevertheless, Vietnamese Americans, a good number of them, are also proud that, a Vietnamese American won the Pulitzer Prize. Now, the issue, though, like you mentioned earlier, is I can't keep my mouth shut. So I criticize Vietnamese Americans for supporting what I think of as racist policies, white supremacist policies, and so on. And this will really upset a lot of Vietnamese Americans. So I have a lot of fights on my hands.
Well, I'm glad you're speaking up. No, I think it is, we often taught to, some of us who are older, kind of keep quiet and all that. But then we find that, we do have a voice, and as Americans, freedom of speech, which is something we treasure, and we can speak up. And what we, and also we and our parents don't sometimes see eye to eye, and that's okay. And so I'm glad you're speaking out, and I want to again congratulate you on the book, and also continuing to speak up. And I now want to kind of touch upon a little bit about the election, the U.S. presidential election coming up, because one of the reasons we are also picking the date, October 3rd, not only because of the 55th anniversary of the Immigration Act, but it's also exactly a month from the U.S. presidential election. And I won't ask you you're voting for, and we're just curious, in terms of our responsibility as Asian Americans to get out and vote, regardless of who you support. But in terms of our responsibilities and also speaking out, I think those are things that as Americans we have right to do. And it's also right now what has been disturbing has been seeing the images in the United States. And then, I did not watch the debates recently. But I think part of this discussion, this Asian American, is really the voice of Asian American. And we do need to exercise that voice when the time comes, not just presidential election, but also being involved in politics. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit in terms of you're very well, as a writer, recognize it, but what do you think about representation? And you also mentioned earlier the board of Pulitzer being very much a white elite. And, right now, if we're invited to sit on board, invited to do certain things, kind of I think we need to be less shy in some ways. I would like to hear your views on that.
I think obviously everybody who's a citizen of a country or even a resident of a country has an obligation to that country, to work for its own betterment. The least we could do is vote, and then obviously also participate in civic organizations of whatever kind, whether joining ones that already exist or starting ones of our own. And both my brother and I have done that in the Vietnamese American context. We looked around, and for my brother, he didn't see a progressive Vietnamese American organization out there, so he started the Progressive Vietnamese Network. For me, because I'm a writer, I didn't see, since I was in college, the existence of Vietnamese American arts organizations to support young Vietnamese American writers and artists. So I started one, or co-started one with others. And these are all parts of civic engagement, whether we want to be involved on the electoral side and politics and law and the government, or whether we want to be involved in arts and culture, which is also a crucial way to make our voice heard. Going back again to the Hollywood example, how many Asian Americans have been deeply damaged by growing up in a culture in which they don't see their own stories and in which they see themselves depicted in racist, horrible ways. And now, we see the power of stories in movies, for example, that can tell our stories, reflect our faces, and make us know that our lives are worth talking about. So that being said, obviously, I think Asian Americans are the same in that regard as other Americans. We all have an obligation to participate civically and politically, and Asian Americans historically have not done that on par with Americans as a whole. We're not alone in doing that. And numerous reasons, including our immigrant and refugee backgrounds and our parents wanting to focus on survival and being afraid of speaking out politically because they could see what the consequences were in their countries of origin for speaking out politically. But times are changing. I mean, again, since 1965, we've been in the United States in increasing numbers for 55 years now. Second and third generations of Asian Americans descended from that 1965 moment are gaining more power and more influence, and we can see changing political attitudes from younger generations versus older generations. And I can see that division in the Vietnamese American community. It's the only Asian American community that has a plurality of people supporting Donald Trump. And younger Vietnamese Americans are very confused and hurt about this because many of them, the majority, I believe, do not support Donald Trump, and they're torn because their parents and grandparents and do support Donald Trump. It's actually really, really emotionally damaging for people. So people are realizing that we just can't talk about these issues internally. We have to speak up, as you were saying. And for Asian Americans in particular, that act of speaking up is really crucial because historically in the United States, we've been associated with silence, and that's partly due to the fact that for many decades, our population was really very small as a percentage. But now I think we're about 6% of the American population. That's a tipping point. And that number hopefully will grow, although obviously current Trump administration policies are designed to stop that growth from taking place. And so there's so many reasons why we need to speak up against cultural perceptions, against stereotypes, against government policies that are aimed to hurt the Asian American population and its growth and its standing in the United States. So, and I think there are people, there are many people who obviously recognize this in the younger generation. So I have some hope for this, that we are seeing something of a sea change. And again, especially that we've been working on multiple fronts. So we have politicians, we have lawyers, but we also have actors, who are speaking up for these political causes, using their platforms to try to encourage people to participate, to speak up, and be a part of American life.
Well, now we have writers, and one of the questions I have for you is really, you talk about Hollywood. I grew up watching movies, learned my English watching American movies. Love Hollywood, but you're right. Growing up, there was very, very not a lot of Asian representation. And one of the things I've always thought was there was not, our parents, our family don't encourage us to be writers. And it sounds like your parents, did they encourage you to be a writer? And now that you are a writer, first of all, your book, did somebody option it in Hollywood? Because I would certainly like to see that movie.
Well, I think my parents treated me with benign neglect when it came to my education. I think they sent me to
you were 4
school.
years old. Yeah, I think your brother probably got most of the attention, yes.
Yeah, well, he was the older son, so I think there was a lot of pressure on him.
So he became the doctor, right?
He became the doctor, and I think I benefited from that. I also benefited from having parents who were, they're deeply conservative, but the one place where they had some liberalism was education. They thought, we'll provide an education for the kids, and then they can do what they want to do. My brother became the doctor, and I think that opened a pathway for me. I fended off my parents for a while by saying I'll be a lawyer, or I'll try pre-med for a little bit. And then before they knew it, I was an English major, and then I was getting a PhD. But at least it was a doctorate, So again, they were actually kind of cool, like with a doctorate on a subject they understood nothing about, which is literature.
Right.
But they didn't encourage me to be a writer. I think that would have been a bridge too far for me to come home and say I want to be a writer, although that's what I was sort of doing on my own time. And so I think I was just happy with them being happy that I had a job as a professor. And then one day I sprung it on them that, hey, I'm a writer, here's a book, or here's a story, and so on. I remember I gave my father once a translated short story well before I had any fiction books published. And it was a story about a Vietnamese refugee who comes to San Francisco in 1975 and discovers he's gay. My parents are deeply conservative Catholics. Never mentioned that story to me again, even though they could have read it because it was in Vietnamese, translated to Vietnamese. So I bring up back home all my books from my parents, and my dad, my mother's passed away. My dad has all of my books arranged on the shelf behind his bed. So I know he's proud of these books, but I don't think he's read any of them. And I think I don't expect him to. He already provided for me. I don't need to impose more on his time to make him read my books. But I think I'm happy. I think he's happy. And CBS is going to do a video with me in about a week or 10 days in San Jose, and they wanted to know if my father wanted to be part of it. And I asked my father, he said yes. So they'll include him in this video. So I think he is proud. The adoption, the adaptation issue, very complicated story. It's been years in the making, but hopefully we're in the final stages of getting to an agreement with TV. So, I mean, the Sympathizer is actually born out of me watching a lot of serial television, like The Sopranos, The Wire, shows like this, not from movies. So
Right.
it makes sense that if it's to be adapted, it would go back into an episodic TV format.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to it. But tell us more about the sequel. You said it's coming out in March?
March 2021. Already done for quite a while. It's supposed to come out in October, but the pandemic has pushed everything back in the publishing world. And if you've read The Sympathizer, it ends with our sympathizer being cast out to sea out of Vietnam, and we don't know where he goes. And I think a lot of people thought, oh, he must be going to the United States. If he's fleeing communism, he must be going to the United States and getting a Happy Meal. And that's actually that was never in my intention. But I finished the book without knowing that I wanted to write a sequel, but I thought, I'm not done with his character. I'm not done with him and his story or the issues that the book raises. And his father is French, so I send him to France, to Paris of 1982. And The Sympathizer is a so-called genre novel, spy, thriller, politics, history. And it's also a philosophical novel. So it's meant to be serious, but a lot of fun. And likewise with The Committed, he's deeply traumatized when he gets to Paris after everything he's been through. And he makes really bad choices. So he becomes a drug dealer, or as he calls it, a capitalist, working for an ethnic Chinese crime boss in Paris. And so there's still a lot of the crime story going on with drugs and violence and all the good gangster stuff to keep you entertained. And then there's also a pretty serious, a philosophical thread about race and colonialism and French identity and its relationship to Vietnam and all of the French colonies, that these issues were really present in the 80s as they are still today.
Well, I'm looking for. In fact, that will be our book that I'm recommending to our book club in March. So we're really looking forward to that. I don't want to take up much for your time. I am so happy, so grateful to speak with you. And I keep those books coming. But I want to end by asking about your son. And your daughter, you're now a father, and you also write quite eloquently now as a father, kind of being maybe kind of more sympathetic to what your father went through. So tell us, what is your American dream for them?
Yeah, well, I grew up with parents who were very supportive in the sense that they provided all my material needs, but very little of my wants and desires. A very typical immigrant and refugee story. And so as a father, of course, I hope that I can achieve a better balance. For example, I had the typical Asian-American story where, the parents never said, I love you. I sort of grew up emotionally stunted, I think, as a result of that. It took me a very, very long time to be able to say, I love you without stuttering and getting all nervous and everything like that. And now, I'm very proud that my brother and I have worked hard on my dad, and he, at 85 years old, is very affectionate and is always saying, I love you, I miss you, and things like that, because I think we just chipped away at him. And with my kids, I think, I want them to, my American dream for them is the dream of the second generation, I think, that I want them to be successful, of course, but I don't really care if they go to Harvard or anything like that, but more to be emotionally happy people who are happy in what they do. And happiness that's a luxury, right? But that's a luxury that I hope that we have. And at least with my own son, who's 7, we have a good emotional relationship. He spontaneously says, I love you, and I say the same to him. And so I think, we wrote a book together, so we spend quality time. My daughter is 9 months old. Who knows? She loves her mommy more than me at this point, but hopefully that will change.
Yeah, maybe she'll become a daddy's girl eventually. So yeah, but I want to thank you.